Hi, everyone. My name is Deborah Kimathi, and I'm delighted to be on Beneath the Impact podcast. We get a chance to explore the system of education and what works and what doesn't. So I'm really excited to share some of my experience and insight, including from my current role at the Learning Generation Initiative.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Beneath the Impact podcast. Today, I'm privileged to have one great person called Deborah Kimathi. We share a name, actually. Kimathi.
We do. And initials.
Yes, so yeah, DK, yeah, who I was privileged to work with, or rather under her leadership was quite good at that time. So, and also her coming to the podcast is quite an honor. Welcome, Deborah. And I'll let her introduce herself because I can't have all the words to introduce her as well. Over to Deborah.
Thanks, Dennis. It's a real privilege to be here. My name's Deborah, as you know. And yeah, we had the privilege of working together for a number of years. I'm currently working at the Learning Generation Initiative, and I oversee our work on education workforce and systems delivery. But yeah, maintain a wide interest in the sector and just how we impact positively, how we drive change that will transform the future for our children.
Yeah. So as you have gotten the hint, she's here because of education. So technically, we did a little bit of research so that we understand how, or rather where the conversation will go. And from the research, we understood like Kenya is usually very proud of its enrollment rate. So especially the number of learners who are in primary and also transition to high school. Those are the conversation which we hear so much time. However, we see there are usually more questions in terms of whether the learners are learning. So looking in terms of Uwezo or Twaweza reports, which are basically an organization that does research in terms of understanding whether the learners are learning, show that there is a trend, or rather 3 out of 10 children in class 3 cannot complete grade 2 level work in literacy and numeracy. And also, posing on that, we understand also there is a lot of changes in workforce that will come up as well. So in terms of that, we see in terms of future of jobs report that came out from, World Economic Forum, showing that most of the jobs that will be in the future, or rather currently right now, will be not future-proof anymore because of emerging trends such as AI, but also the different trends in climate change as well as energy transition. So before we start here, I would like to ask Deborah, what is learning? Because we have to start from there, a very basic thing, understand what is learning according to her. Yeah, over to you, Deborah.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think what you've shared shows us that there's a difference in kind of quantity and quality. And where I think a lot of our focus has been historically and driven by sets of goals like the Millennium Development Goals. The goals were access. How many children can we get into school? And there's been a shift over recent years to actually think about quality alongside that. So it's not just children being in school, but ensuring that their learning is taking place. And there's this interesting phrase that goes around the education sector of are we schooling but not learning? How do we transform schooling into learning? But I think just to kind of step back, learning, I mean, it happens to all of us in different ways, whether we like it or not, right from the time we're infants. We don't choose to learn necessarily. It's a natural human process. It's how we grow. It's how we adapt to new environments. It's how we form relationships with other people. But basically, learning is acquiring new knowledge, acquiring new skills, adapting new behaviors, understanding new experiences. And it happens in a whole range of ways. It shapes who we are. It shapes how we function. It shapes maybe the pathways we'll follow in terms of growth, development, learning, career. And it helps us adapt to new seasons of life, new challenges, etc. Learning is really at the core of everything. You'll hear educators throw around this phrase about Bloom's taxonomy. which to those of us outside education sounds a bit like German, but Bloom's is essentially a framework that helps educators think about how learning takes place. And it looks at different kind of levels of learning and how learners progress from one to the next. And so it starts off with simple remembering. So the very first stage of learning is remembering. The second is understanding. The third is applying. Then you go to analyze, evaluate, and create. And actually, if you look at how a small child learns, you can almost see those stages happen step by step. A small child starts by maybe copying as a way of remembering. They copy something you say, something you do. Then they go to actually understanding it. And of course, then understanding begins to take them to applying. So they begin to do things for themselves. And the most critical stages of learning, and sadly, where we've often invested the least, is actually the higher levels of Bloom, the analyzing, the evaluating, the creating. And this is where learners are actually taking the knowledge and using it, doing something with it, creative, solving problems, etc. And again, you can see the same kind of transition we see from one level of Bloom's to the other in the way that teaching has progressed over the years. So we know 844 in many ways was characterized by rote memorization. So the teacher stands at the front of the class, writes 1,000 facts on the board. The learners have to copy. They read back. So they're just copy-paste, just remembering, memorization. They're not necessarily applying the knowledge. They're not necessarily using it to create new knowledge. They're not putting it into practice. Whereas now, if you look at CBC, the transition we've made, learning is more about applying the knowledge. It's more about taking that and creating new knowledge from what we have in front of us. And off the back of that, again, educators will talk about pedagogy, which is basically just the way that we teach. And the way that we teach is driven by, first of all, which level in Bloom's we're trying to work on. Are we trying to develop understanding, or are we trying to develop utilization, creation of knowledge? And there are so many teaching methodologies that come into play. Some of those that are closely connected to our current education systems are experiential learning, inquiry-based learning, even play-based learning for younger learners, where it's really about actively engaging with knowledge and not being kind of passive recipients of knowledge.
Yeah.
So that's, as a starter, I think we can begin to kind of think about learning.
Yeah. I think from the Bloom's right now, I was to ask you what are the learning outcomes, because it's one of the things that usually come up every time. So in terms of what are learning outcomes, but from the Bloom's, I can see it. Maybe you can build on that as well. Yeah.
And learning outcomes is an interesting one, because I think in many ways, learning outcomes has been a bit of a political agenda, both with a big P and a small p.
Yeah.
Because learning outcomes, which have typically in our system been represented by exam results, if you think of how exam results are used, they're used by development and aid actors to shape a whole agenda around development and investment and education. And we know all of that comes back to many controversial issues around who is influencing the system, who is shaping what learning outcomes means, who is shaping the curriculum, where is other influences and other kind of forms of soft power coming into play. And so learning outcomes in that kind of space have been very politicized. Then we have learning outcomes at the school level. Often they're simply a marketing tool. And I guess that's partly what I would call politics with a small p, where the school wants to be able to shout about how well they are performing, how well their learners are achieving, whether that's to parents or to investors. I mean, I think it happens on different levels, and it becomes kind of this status symbol. And I think with all of that, what has happened is we've lost the real essence of what learning outcomes should represent. Learning outcomes, as the name suggests, should be about learning.
Yeah.
And the learning should be about the learner.
Yeah.
And it's sad, actually, that so often we kind of miss that part, even in our classrooms. When a teacher assesses a child to understand how they are performing, understand their learning outcomes. It should be with the purpose of then improving the teaching and learning in the classroom, with the purpose of shifting that learner to progress from one level to the next. And so learning outcomes should be focused on targeting support to the child, targeting support to particular schools, targeting resources, whether that's from the teachers, whether that's from the parents, the head teachers, the other officers we have beyond the school, like curriculum support officers, quality assurance officers. Learning outcome should be the data that's shaping the work of all of those people in support of the child. So all of these politics, both big P and small p, often get in the way, sadly. Whereas actually, the real value of learning outcome data is in shaping and reshaping learning in ways that support the child. And so I think this is something that actually needs our attention as we've reformed our education system from 2017 when the CBC pilot was released up until now. We've had a lot of attention on curriculum. More recently, a lot of attention on assessment. And sadly, I don't think we're quite there yet. If you talk to parents, they tell you typically they're very confused. They don't know what it means that their child is meeting expectations or not. They want to know, is my child number 1? Is my child number 5? What's happening? And so then teachers find themselves being kind of pushed and pulled from the new system to the old, trying to bring parents into the discourse in ways, again, that are meaningful. So I think we have a long way to go. And to add to that, I mean, learning outcomes as a measure of how well our children are learning. I think we've learned over the years very well how to measure things like literacy and numeracy. Those seem fairly straightforward. But the core competencies of the CBC, critical thinking, imagination and creativity, citizenship, how do you measure those things? Collaboration, communication, those are things that are not as easy to measure in a traditional exam. So how do we shift our understanding of measurement, shift our understanding of assessment in ways that allow us to kind of evaluate a child's learning, not for the politics, but for the support to the child to be adequate and targeted as it should be. So
I think from what I'm hearing, we need a mindset shift, especially for us to, and it's not just for the teachers, but also for the whole ecosystem, whereby the parents, for example, for them to understand what is meeting expectations, but also for the politicians, the people who are making decisions in terms of how do we use now the data to ensure that the learners achieve, or rather they are prepared for tomorrow. Talking of preparation for tomorrow, do you think the current learning system, or rather our education system, the way it is, it's prepared for us to reach, for children to get jobs, or rather for them to be future-proof in terms of that? Do you think that's something that it's adequate?
Yeah. So I think that's actually a more complicated question than it seems on the surface. So I think the slightly obvious answer is no. I don't think necessarily our system is fully preparing children for the future. But I would kind of piggyback two things on that. One, I would ask if any system is. Did the system you and I went through a few years ago, I won't say a number, did it really prepare us for the world we're facing today? Is there any system anywhere in the world that has sufficient foresight to really understand what the future holds in a way to shape today's education system? I don't know that there is. There are more unknowns than knowns in our future. And I think we hear this phrase around the pace of change. And I think even in your opening statement, you said something about just this increasingly complex world that we live in. It's not getting simpler. So what we know about the future is actually decreasing rather than increasing. So I would question whether any system in the world is able to really prepare learners in any kind of fully comprehensive way for the future. So whilst I might say no to the question about Kenya's system, it's not a Kenya problem. It's a bigger problem. But I also think we can flip the script a little bit and ask ourselves if the core workforces that our society needs, are they future ready also? So if we think about the teacher workforce, about the health workforce, are those workforces shaped in ways that are ready to serve future generations of employees and future generations of service users? So I think looking at it from those two things, I mean, first, this question of, is any system ready? In some ways, it comes back to this fundamental question of, what is the purpose of education? And what shaped education in its current form? Most scholars will say it was shaped by the Industrial Revolution of the last century. We're now 100 years on. Have we changed much fundamentally in how education functions, or in how we've thought about its purpose and intention? Or actually, do we just kind of keep trying to tweak an old model? Do we need to completely revolutionize how we think about education and its purpose? And in doing so, of course, then we rethink about the role of learners, the role of teachers, the role of school leaders, the role of the system. And so as we think about how systems prepare learners, prepare all of us for the unknown, how can our system do that better? What are the skills our children really need for the future? When I think of my own kids, I find myself feeling like the math, the English, the science, the history, whatever they're learning in school, yes, holds value, but its value is limited without a kind of parallel set of skills of discernment, of empathy, of how to leverage their own agency, of how to use data and knowledge. The children of today will never lack access to knowledge, at least those, I'm talking about children, I guess, who have access to internet and gadgets and whatever. And it's important to acknowledge there's a huge portion of children in our country who don't have that access. But those who do, they will never be short of knowledge as such. And so the bigger skills gap is what to do with that knowledge, how to use it to better themselves and humanity around them. And I think when I think about the skills they need for the future, the one for me that sits right to the core is learning to learn. If you think about even our generation, am I allowed to put us in the same generation?
Yeah.
The number of things we've had to learn and relearn as adults, I feel like it's only going to be more extreme for the next generation and every generation that comes after that, because the pace of change is so fast. So what does it mean to learn to learn? And how do we learn to learn more efficiently in ways that make us better human beings?
Yeah.
And I think that's a tricky one. And when I think of the world around us, I feel like one of the biggest gaps we have in the world right now is not knowledge, it's not skills, but it's leadership. And it's leadership driven by values, leadership driven by empathy, leadership driven by just an intention to equitably serve the people of the world. And so what does it mean to shape an education system that gives us the right kind of global, national, regional, local leaders that we need? What does that look like? How do we get those leaders who are focused on kind of ensuring just leadership for just systems that serve across the board? So I think, a whole range of questions there around the purpose of education. And then, like I said, I think it's also the workforce needs to adjust. Even now, as we look, for example, at the education workforce, how do we kind of reorient to a new future? How do we adjust? The same way the system of education has functioned for a different time, potentially for a different purpose, perhaps the education workforce has too. And some of the work that we've done at the Learning Generation has been looking at kind of how traditional models of schooling have this one teacher surrounded by children with a huge diversity of needs and a huge diversity of goals. And how does that one teacher support, in some cases, hundreds of students? Whereas if we flip that on its head and think of a paradigm shift in how the education workforce functions, where instead of the teacher being at the center surrounded by learners, you have the learner at the center, surrounded by the various experts and specialized sets of skills that they need, the learner is much more likely to thrive. And it was interesting that the theme of this year's World Teachers' Day, which was just this past weekend, was about shifting from kind of isolation to collaboration for the teaching workforce. And so what does it look like for us to have a more collaborative teacher workforce that brings together different skills in support of the learner? And we've seen from our own research that that often leads to more effective teaching, that it leads to teachers feeling better supported and better motivated, that it leads to a higher number of hours of instructional time for children. They're more likely to get the specialized care and support that they need, and as I say, more likely to thrive. But again, that calls for then different kinds of intelligences. So we need teachers to then be relationally intelligent, emotionally intelligent, able to build those relationships across the system in support of the child. As we think of the workforce of the future, I mean, look at how maybe our generations are working. They work gig to gig. They don't stay in the same job for 10, 15 years. They want more flexible working hours. They tend to have more specialized kind of niche skills. What does all of that mean for how we shape our education workforce, maybe even our health workforce and beyond? But what does that mean for how we think about the education workforce that will serve the education system for the future? And maybe it's time to completely rethink that as well in ways that will serve an upcoming generation of teachers who actually want to work quite differently. So I think there's a lot to rethink, a lot to reimagine.
Yeah.
And I think, yes, we have to think about it in terms of what children are learning in classrooms. But I think we need that broader systems lens that looks at how the whole system functions, how the workforce supports that learning, how the workforce itself is designed in ways that embrace the skills and competencies needed to nurture the next generation in readiness for the future.
So from the discussion, I think one thing I'm picking is one key skill for the learners to have is learning to learn, and also which makes me to think also maybe we also need systems that are learning to learn as well. Both from the policy level, so thinking of curriculum, thinking of education, MOE that is, but also at a small p at the school level, whereby the school policies also are learning to learn and also supporting the learners' aspiration and goals where they want to be. So the systems needs to be flexible, and I think that's one challenge especially that we see having us where we are right now, and the flexibility is not coming for. So how do you think we can achieve that?
It's interesting. There's a phrase that's thrown around a lot in education spaces at the moment, which is data-driven decision making. And it's essentially exactly what you just said. How do schools become learning organizations in and of themselves? How do counties, how do nations become, how does an education system become a learning organization? And we see good intention from the Kenyan government in this. There's a lot of focus right now on reforming the education management information systems that drive or could potentially drive that data-driven decision-making. We do see a commitment within the sector and from government to make evidence-based decisions. So there are some bright spots. I think where we often miss is that it needs to be a whole kind of shift in organizational culture. It's not kind of isolated ad hoc uses of data, but rather a broad-based kind of reimagining of how we make decisions in the sector. And for that to happen, I think we need to think very carefully around where does the data for learning come from? And how does it flow? How does it move? How does it tie to decision-making processes? So right now, data is collected from our schools, from exams, and it tends to go up through the system. It reaches the national level, and that's it. And there is intent from government to do this, but how do you make sure the data also flows back down, and has lots of kind of feedback loops along the way, so that the data as it flows from classroom to head teachers already influencing then back what happens in the classroom, as it flows from head teacher to the middle tier, the curriculum support officer or whoever, how it then flows both upwards to influence policy, but also flows back to the classroom to target support in ways that are needed. So I think there's some thinking to be done around how systems can become learning organizations. And again, this is something we've done quite a bit of work on, and particularly looking at how systems address complexity. So if we just look at CBC, for example, CBC on paper and by intent, I think there's a lot of really positive things in there. I think the intent to acknowledge a broader set of skills, the intent to nurture those within the system. But the challenge has been in the complexity of implementation. You mentioned right at the beginning the report from Musawa Agenda on learning, and there are serious deficits. But if you take Nairobi and compare it to Turkana, again, you see a massive difference. So our systems of implementation have not supported equity, and so we have these huge disparities. So the design of the system is one thing, the implementation is a whole other thing. And so how do we think about implementation in ways that address that complexity, that as challenges arise, we're able to find solutions that are driven by collaboration, driven by strong leadership, rooted in data and evidence, and ensure that the system has that agility to respond to those challenges, to navigate those complexities in ways that allow it to really thrive and address some of these bigger issues. So I think being a learning system is definitely one way forward. I think in terms of other issues that need our attention, we can't deny there's a huge amount of waste in our system.
Yeah.
Yet teachers, parents, children are constantly crying out for more resources. If you ask almost any teacher today in Kenya what they need, they'll say they need more teaching and learning materials. They'll say they need more support for themselves, more professional development for themselves. And our system is not lacking in resource. It's not lacking in expertise. All of those things are there. We actually have a very rich system. But resource-wise, there are some leaks.
Yeah.
How do we fix those leaks in ways that we ensure that our system is adequately resourced, that our children get the kind of education they deserve? We heard from a former president a few years ago that we lose, was it 2 billion shillings a day?
Yeah.
I don't want to imagine how that figure has shifted over the last, is it 4 or 5 years since it was said?
Yeah.
If we just recovered even 50% of that, we would make a huge dent in delivering the kind of education that our children deserve. So how do we build a system, one that's a learning system, but also two, that's a system that's transparent and accountable, that we can track where those leakages are and we can plug the holes in ways that ensure more resources get down to the learner level. If you look at how much the capitation for our learners in primary school, I think it's something like 1,200 shillings. I need to confirm the figure, but for a whole year. I mean, it's not enough to ensure that a child has a decent education. But then if you consider how much of that actually makes it to the classroom, it's even more disturbing. So I think a transparent, accountable system is another big gap. And I think the other challenge our sector faces is just fragmentation in the system. We have a number of different directorates within the ministry. We then have a multitude of sagas, many with overlapping mandates. And so what that leads to often is a kind of push and pull over power and resources and influence, rather than a strategic collaborative approach where everybody is collectively pursuing one thing. And so I think there's work to be done to overcome the fragmentation in our system. And that all takes leadership. So the right leadership in place would be another big enabler of really ensuring that the system can get to where it needs to get to.
Nice. I think especially the resource politics around it as well, it's deterring us. And for the first point which you had mentioned, I was especially thinking of Nairobi and Turkana. How can we leverage, for example, local-led initiatives or innovations from, for example, Turkana? How do they think education for themselves, and what purpose is it serving for them to build it up as well?
Yeah. I think that's huge. And I think I mentioned agility as being one of the factors that allows us to kind of navigate the complexities of the system. And to say we need to serve every region equitably is not assuming that it's an easy thing to do. But how do we look at the resources that we have in our hands? And I think one of the things that really holds potential for future is just looking around us at we have people of all ages who are innovating, using technology and otherwise, who are ready to kind of shape education in new ways. And so not suggesting that they should be functioning kind of outside of the system or outside of the curriculum. There might be some circumstances that call for that, but even within the parameters of the system, the parameters of what it means to deliver CBC well, how do we make sure we're thinking about that in ways that allow for kind of agility and agency, where a teacher in Turkana can say, okay, this might work in Nairobi, but it won't work here. What do I do differently? And where they're empowered to do that differently. So again, in the work that Learning Generation have done on problem solving, we talk about empowered autonomy. So how do you make sure that a teacher, one, is aware of those innovations happening around them, two, has the autonomy to say, if I bring this into my classroom, it will help my children thrive, and third, is empowered to know that they can do so without getting into trouble. And in fact, that it could be a really positive win for them and for the sub-county, the county, and the system in turn, because then that learning will trickle upwards through the system as well.
Yeah. Oh, awesome. So, since you're talking about the future, so how do you personally imagine education 10 years to come? How would it look like, and what steps would we take for us to reach your vision of education? Deb.
So it's interesting because I find when people ask me what is the purpose of education or what's the vision of education, I feel like there's so much unknown. It's hard to say it needs to look like X. And I think in some ways, my vision of education is that we're ready for whatever the future holds, or as ready as we can be. And I guess there's a few things that stick out. I think for that to happen, we need this transparent, accountable education system. And I think we've seen varying degrees of success with how our system holds itself to account. We've had some leaders that have really led the way in holding our systems to account. But sadly, we have others who are not. So what are the other levers of accountability that we can activate? How do parents become a driver of holding systems accountable? And how do we collaborate with parents in a way where they really understand what it means for a child to have access to quality teaching and learning? So instead of saying, oh, our school needs a fence or our classrooms need painted, how about they start thinking about what's the quality of what's happening in the classroom? Is the teacher well-resourced? Is the teacher well-supported? How is my child learning to read, to count, to do kind of critical problem solving? And so how do we activate parents and teachers to hold the system to account in ways that really matter? So I think the system of the future has to be transparent and accountable. I think it has to be equitable. And I think that's possibly the biggest challenge of our time. How do we craft an equitable system so that whether my child goes to school in Nairobi or Wajir or Garissa or Muranga, wherever, that they get the same quality of education. That instead of having to drive my child an hour across town to get to a better school, that actually I just know the school in my neighborhood is as good as the next one. So how do we nurture that kind of equity in the system? And what does that look like? And how do we lean in, like you say, to innovation, to local leadership, even to technology, to ensure that equity? Part of an interesting conference recently where the keynote speaker was essentially saying that inequity is the driver of all the crises we see around us, of war, conflict, of immigration, poverty. All of these failures of the world around us are essentially driven by inequity. So how do we address equity right from the education system, so that becomes a foundation for how society functions in an equitable way? I think the third thing I see in the system of the future is a sense of collective leadership. I think the ideal education system is one where the cabinet secretary for education and the teacher in the classroom are collectively leading education, and not just on the surface, but in a way where they're both influencing decision making, they're both influencing policy, they're both influencing what happens to the child in that classroom, and there's a shared vision, a shared sense of accountability. There's a shared passion for seeing each and every child succeed. And that collective leadership, it's not just the teacher and the CS, but it's the parents, it's the quality assurance officers, it's the school leaders, it's the other community members. How do we craft that collective vision that's led across the board? And I think when we look at Indigenous models of leadership, they're often collective, they're often communal. How do we lean into that rather than depending on perhaps the structures that colonialism give us that are more about having an elite rule over the masses than they are about collectively solving our shared challenges? And so we keep using this word reimagining, but I think that's a lot of the work that has to be done. And it comes right back again to the questions of like, how is our system designed and what was it designed to do? And there's an interesting analogy, I think, from our justice system. And if you look at the history of our police force, it was designed to protect the elite from the masses. And essentially, it's still what it does today. So how do we apply that same thinking to understanding how the education system is built, and how do we use that to reimagine what it should do for the future? And I think the other big piece of the future system for education is there has to be a shift in how we think about the role of the teacher. And CBC has already attempted to do this. So in fact, if you read into CBC and the basic education curriculum framework that KICD put together to guide the development of CBE, it positions teachers as facilitators. So they're no longer the kind of font of all knowledge that stands at the front of the class and kind of lists facts for children to remember. They should be facilitators of learning. And so what does that mean? Our children, as I say, don't need facts from teachers anymore. What they need to do is learn how to analyze, learn how to discern sources of information. And they need to learn how to connect with people. They need to learn all of those other forms of intelligence, the emotional intelligence, relational intelligence, cultural intelligence that will actually allow them to thrive in the unknown. And I think as well, teachers have always been role models, not just to the children they teach, but to the broader community. And so how do we kind of get back to that part of our system where teachers are respected as role models, where they're actually the ones modeling empathy, modeling justice, modeling connection, modeling all of the things, all of the values that we want our children to have for the futures. Not that it should be wholly dependent on teachers, but that they should be models of those things. And we should be holding, again, to account them for that and expecting that of them, but also respecting and enabling the profession in a way that allows them to do that. So yeah, I think as we look forward, we have to think about values. Values underpin everything. And so what are the values driving our system? What are the values driving our teaching workforce? We have to reimagine the workforce. We can't just keep going as is. We know the teacher shortage we expect to see by 2030, I think, is globally 44 million teachers. In the next 5 years, we're not going to change that by keeping business as usual. So we have to reimagine. It's centering equity. I think those are going to be the big pieces of what shape our future.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I think from what I'm hearing, usually even, especially thinking about system thinking, we usually say a system is designed to give the results that we see. So the results that we see, it's what that system is designed to give. And you're reiterating that point. Any parting shot for today?
No, I mean, you've just sparked something in me because I think we often talk about systems transformation.
Yeah.
And I remember a colleague from a network we were in who works in South Africa saying, maybe the system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. And so actually, maybe the key is not to tweak the current system, but to completely reimagine it. And there's some interesting work that was done by the former Minister of Education in Sierra Leone and Brookings Institute. And they talk about the 4 Ps of systems change. And they talk about 1, redefining purpose, 2, reimagining pedagogy, so the way that we teach and what we teach. 3, repositioning system elements like workforce, like leadership, like supervision, like examination assessment. And 4, redistributing power. And actually, I think if we sat down and had a serious conversation with ourselves about purpose, pedagogy, the system elements, and power, we would make a lot of progress.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for tuning in to the podcast. Please follow us, like, and subscribe for more episodes like this. Thank you very much.
Thanks for tuning in to Beneath the Impact, where we go beyond the numbers and narratives to uncover what really drives change. If today's conversation sparked a thought, shifted your perspective, or started a question, don't keep it to yourself. Share this episode, like, subscribe, leave us a comment, and join the conversation online. You can find us at beneath.the.impact on all socials. Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and keep digging beneath the impact.